So first of all, thank you to Alex and Dan and Greg and Bridget and Diane. This is really just, and Tom, of course, a terrific conference or symposium. As I mentioned this morning, I'm not a scholar of famines. I'm a scholar of war and conflict. And I tend to be at the 30,000 feet, so I think about it strategically, both internationally and globally. And there are some cases I know really, really well, including Sudan and South Sudan. But Yemen I've been following not as closely as some other conflicts. And so what I'm going to do is just give a broad overview of where I think the conflict's at right now. And then hand it over to Martha and Diane. So as we know, it began as a political crisis. Does this work, the pointer work? Yeah. Looks like I just blocked it. So we all know where, in this group, I'm sure we all know where it's located. But I think more importantly, it's in a pretty nasty neighborhood. And that's what's driving the conflict. It's driving to some extent the famine and the humanitarian crises because, of course, ports are being shut down and people aren't having the ability to get medical food and other kinds of services. So it began as a political crisis when the former government refused to hand over power, and that, of course, was President Saleh to his deputy Hadi in 2011. Currently, the estimates are there's an airstrike by the Saudis every 94 minutes, and that since we've been sitting here, Save the Children projects that 40 children have died. Just since we've been seeing 190 children are dying every day. In 2017, they projected that 50,000 died. The current fighting, one of the sad things about Yemen, and as a student of civil wars and large-scale violence, I mentioned this morning, violence begets violence. So similar to Sudan, Yemen, but many other places, Afghanistan, that once a country has a civil war, the chances of it having another is much increased, and it's much harder to resolve those second wars. The interests become incredibly entrenched. It's also happening in a time where there's a resurgence of religion, and I don't want to say that this war is about religion, but religion plays a role. It's been instrumentalized, it's been politicized, not only locally, but regionally. So the Houthi rebelled against a weak government. They were upset with Hadi when he was making some changes. And they're predominantly Shia, and they're in a Shia neighborhood with Iran, while the government was predominantly Sunni. And the Houthi are a minority, about 75% of the population, 25% of the population, and they began with a theological creed when they first emerged of peace. And actually, this transformation from sort of a war-fighting, violent sort of group is relatively new. And so now they are known for a particular slogan, which is called "God is great, death to America, death to Israel, God curse the Jews, and victory to Islam," which makes it seem as if they are absolutely driven by religion, but actually it's not. What they're driven by is anti-imperialism, and they want a government that's responsive and that will be representative to them. So they, first and foremost, a political group that happens to be a Shia branch of Islam, and actually a Zaydiya, even a different branch. The Saudis back them against the Houthis. So where religion comes in is actually in the regional dimensions, because Saudi Arabia is really concerned that the Houthis have now become an Iranian-backed group. And so the Saudis actually really started coming in and backing the government against the Houthis, while Iran has backed them. But the evidence does not seem that it's as much as the Iranians would like us to believe. Because in some sense, the Iranians want to embed the Saudis in this because they're trying to get regional dominance, each of them in the region. And as all of us know in the room, the U.S. has lent its support to the Saudi effort. But for the Houthis, this remains a local conflict that has become embroiled in a larger regional struggle. The conflict's in its third year. As I said, it happens in a history of division and political instability, which is not a good thing. And it's now a humanitarian and a strategic crisis. On the humanitarian level, I think Diane's could probably go through a lot of the data on the humanitarian level. I've given you a little bit. But at the strategic level, what's happening is that as more and more parties come into the conflict and schisms happen within those parties, it makes it that much more difficult for the conflict to be resolved. So one of the paradoxical situations is that both sides are trying to fight al-Qaeda and ISIS, right, which are embedded in there. And al-Qaeda, Arabian Peninsula is pretty strong and has been in the region for over a decade. And of course, ISIS, or IS, Islamic State, likes vacuums, security vacuums, and so it's made headway. And so you've got both sides, this Saudi-led coalition fighting against that, but then also you have the other side fighting as well. So in this regard, they're all on the same side, yet they're still fighting each other. And so the crisis between Iran and Saudi Arabia, it goes back 4 decades, and it started pretty much with the Iranian Revolution, whereby Iran, much to the chagrin of the Saudis, held itself up as the center of the Islamic world. And it was, but in part because most people today, when they think about Iran, think of it as the Shia representative, but actually it started as an ecumenical revolution, if you go back and look what the Iranians were trying to do. And that threatened the Saudi dominance of trying to be the representative of the Muslim world, because it saw itself as the home to Mecca and Medina, of course, two of the holiest cities in the Islamic world. And so domestically, the Saudis faced a problem because at the same time, they had extremists ramping up pressure on the Saudi government to be a little bit more Islamist, less secular. And they started sort of saying, okay, we want you to promulgate this Salafist form of Islam, and then they started promulgating that throughout the region. So what you had was a ramping up of religious ideas. You've got the Iranians with a revolutionary theological doctrine countering Saudis who are now facing a domestic crisis after the Grand Mosque taking over by Salafists who wanted the state to be more representative of a more extremist form, or more fundamentalist, I should say, form of Islam. So this explains also why Iran supports Assad in Syria, who is also a largely a-religious secular leader, because, of course, they're trying to expand their influence into Lebanon as well, which is also Shia, and also get the Saudis further embedded into Yemen. And then we can talk about the Iran-Iraq War, where the Saudis backed Saddam Hussein as well. So this has been a long-running sort of conflict for the two of them. So if you look, and related to that, the broader overlay to this is that religion writ large globally has become, to many people, a threat. And there has been a global resurgence of religion. And if you think about global politics, prior to the 1990s, the real struggle was communism versus capitalism, right? And so you can look here, there's been two sort of upticks in religiously inspired civil wars in the 1970s and then in the 2000s. And that's because you started to see religious actors, both for good and for ill, challenging governments and saying, we want you to be more representative of the people, to represent political rights more humanely, more justly. And so religious actors were moving into the political arena. So you actually had an uptick in religiously inspired violence and civil wars as some states were trying to democratize and open up in the 1970s. And then we've seen another flow of that in the 2000s. And so Yemen is sort of caught up in this sort of global resurgence of religion. And now, of course, as part of this proxy war. So what does Iran get, in a sense? Iran drains Saudi finances. This is costing the Saudis quite a bit. It's keeping the Saudis engaged in Yemen and away from becoming even more deeply embedded in Syria. And it damages Saudi Arabia's international credibility. And of course, when I say Saudi Arabia, I'm talking about the entire coalition, including the United States, by the way. It has poor targeting of its airstrikes, and the naval blockade, as we know, has created a humanitarian crisis. We heard about that this morning. And then, as I mentioned, Saudi Arabia does fear encirclement, and it sees Iran as a threat to its territory, regional influence, and with key Western allies. So if you think about the Syrian civil war and this embeddedness, so it moved from sort of a local demonstration to a civil war to now an internationalized civil war with religious tint. And it turns out these are the most difficult kinds of civil wars to resolve. They tend to last longer, whereas the average civil war lasts about 5 years. Religiously inspired and wars that have an international tint to them last anywhere from 7 years on up to 15. They're harder to negotiate, and by negotiated settlement. And as we know, there's been a couple of attempts, but they failed, in part because we don't know who's going to represent each side. They're more deadly. So if you look at the data, non-combatants are targeted more readily, in part because they go after softer targets. And they're more likely to recur. Again, that idea that they're harder to settle, and even if they're settled, each side tends to buy time. And then since the 1990s, it has tended to engage Arab Muslim societies. And this is not to implicate either Arab or Muslim societies. In part, this is sort of the movement because of the Arab Spring to try to open up these systems. And these transitioning systems are the most prone to civil war as you're opening up political systems, makes them more vulnerable to large-scale violence. In terms of why should we care? Greg's already mentioned it. 3/4 of the population are in need of humanitarian assistance, including 1.3 million in acute need, requiring immediate assistance to survive. And according to one set of data, an increase of 1 million since June of last year, so just a year ago. We're not sure how many people have died. The number that gets bandied around is 10,000, but as I said, Save the Children thinks it's much higher, and wounded at least 52,000. It's a strategic crisis. Again, it's exacerbating regional tensions. AQ, AP, so Al-Qaeda, Arabian Peninsula, and IS remain active, and actually they've become more active. And of course, Yemen is strategically important. It sits on the Bab al-Mandab Strait, and it's a waterway that links the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, through which most of the world's oil passes. So, if you look at the current play, again, this is the distribution of Shia Sunni Muslims. That is playing out. So, but it's, again, instrumentalization of religion. It's not religion on its own. And in these states, it's a way of sort of mobilizing the populations. And then who controls Yemen? It is split. Yemen used to be two countries. It was North Yemen and South Yemen, and you do see there is a split. And then you can see where the international terrorist organizations are active as well. And they have pretty clear control. And then who supports whom? I've already alluded to this. The Houthis are supported by Iran. The Hadi government is supported by the Saudi-led coalition. But what's striking about that coalition is there are divisions in it. The UAE actually supports the South in Yemen, and Saudi Arabia supports the North. So even if you can get them to the negotiating table, there's disagreements within, even among allies, about what to do and how to resolve this, whether to do a federal system, a centralized system, that sort of thing. And then paradoxically, all of them are fighting Al-Qaeda and IS. So conclusion, I think this is a clear case of conflict-linked famine, unlike Venezuela, which is politically induced famine, I think repressive famine. This one is a case where it was already a state that was on tender hooks, but then the conflict has ratcheted it up. I'm not optimistic, knowing what I know about most civil wars, it's going to end any time soon, and in part because once religion becomes part of a conflict, what I've discovered is there's a ratchet effect. It's really hard to demobilize religion. There's been 10 conflicts where religion went from a peripheral issue, which is right now in Yemen. The combatants abide by different traditions, although there are tactical alliances. But once it becomes central, and it may, it's really hard to de-escalate that. And you can think about Sudan. In the first civil war, religion was peripheral, but by the second, it became much more central. And you ended up having to get two states out of it. The local politics remain unresolved, and the regional politics remain unresolved. And until that happens, I don't think it's going to end anytime soon. So I'll end it there.